The instant I witnessed 3 police cars descending upon my disabled brother as he fished from his wheelchair, I realized the Willowbrook HOA was in the process of making the most costly error of their miserable lives. Envision the scene. It's daybreak, utterly silent, save for the sound of chirping birds. The scent of morning dew on pine needles hangs in the air. Then, abruptly, the intrusive roar of diesel engines and the crackle of gravel beneath tires breaks the peace, as 3 patrol vehicles speed toward our private family lake as if my brother Garrett were some sort of armed insurgent. He, however, is merely sitting there in his wheelchair, fishing rod in hand, likely confused about the commotion. This is a man who sacrificed both his legs defending our nation in Afghanistan, and he was now being treated like a felon for catching base on his own property. What that unhinged HOA president didn't realize was that her little abuse of power was about to set her back for $1 million and put her in federal prison. Let me rewind and explain how we arrived at this point. My name is Damon Reeves, and this entire ordeal began because a would-be tyrant could not tolerate seeing someone else's happiness. You see, my brother Garrett and I inherited this scenic 12-acre lakefront estate from our grandfather, situated just outside the Willowbrook subdivision. The old man excavated that 3-acre lake himself back in the 1960s, armed with only a backhoe and sheer determination. It was his pride and joy, fed by natural springs and stocked with bass and trout. When Garrett returned from Afghanistan without his legs, that lake transformed into his sanctuary. The soft whir of his motorized wheelchair moving across the wooden dock, the gentle splash of his line striking the water, these were the sounds that, for a time, silenced his nightmares. For him, fishing was more than a pastime. It was his therapy. Enter Victoria Ashworth. Imagine a woman who presses her jeans and brandishes an iPad as if it were Excalibur. She had relocated to our area about a decade prior, promptly got herself elected HOA president, and resolved to enhance our small piece of paradise, regardless of whether we approved. The first time I encountered Victoria, she strode across my property line in her pricey heels, with a beleaguered surveyor in tow. The fragrance of her cloying perfume reached me before she even spoke. "Mr. Reeves," she began, in that syrupy, false tone that makes you shudder, "I believe there has been some confusion regarding your lake. I'm just standing there in my work boots and coveralls. I own a precision machining company, so I don't present a very menacing figure. And this woman in a tailored blazer is informing me that my family's lake is somehow the property of the HOA. This body of water," she went on, tapping her iPad as if quoting from a holy text, "partially encroaches on our commons area. The Homeowners Association will require you to halt all unauthorized recreational activities immediately." I retrieved my grandfather's original 1962 property deed. It was perfectly clear. Every single square inch of that lake is on Reeves family land. My grandpa dug it himself long before most of these houses were even conceived. Victoria gave the documents a cursory glance. "These might be forgeries," she remarked with a dismissive shrug. "Our legal counsel will need to confirm their authenticity." It was then that I understood we were up against a unique brand of delusion. But the thing about bullies is that they rarely stop with a single target. In the following months, Victoria initiated what I can only describe as a campaign of intimidation. She arranged for HOA patrols that, by some strange coincidence, always seemed to pass our property just as Garrett was fishing. She lodged noise complaints about the motor on his wheelchair. Can you fathom that? A disabled veteran's mobility aid was apparently a public nuisance. The HOA newsletter began running anonymous grievances about unsightly fishing equipment and improper use of waterfront areas. Garrett, who had given so much for his country, started to become withdrawn. On some days, I would see him just sitting at the window, gazing at his fishing gear, untouched. What truly angered me was how Victoria sowed seeds of distrust among our neighbors. She would corner people by their mailboxes, murmuring about how I was uncooperative and hostile to community regulations. Most of the people in Willowbrook are good folks, but they were only hearing Victoria's version of events. The woman was methodical, I'll grant her that. Each week brought a fresh complaint, a new threat, another demand. She turned every bureaucratic instrument at her disposal into a weapon, transforming ordinary neighborly existence into a legal minefield. But Victoria made one fatal error. She presumed we would simply capitulate. She saw Garrett in his wheelchair and perceived weakness. She saw me in my work clothes and perceived someone incapable of fighting back. She had no clue that this disabled veteran, sitting peacefully by our family lake, was on the verge of becoming instrumental in uncovering the largest fraud operation our county had ever witnessed. Victoria's first significant assault was cloaked in the guise of civic responsibility, because nothing exemplifies neighborliness quite like using government agencies against a disabled veteran. I was in my workshop, overhauling a transmission, when a white county truck pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Jim Patterson, a county inspector, looking as though he would prefer a root canal. The poor man was holding a clipboard, his face bearing the expression of someone dispatched to look into Sasquatch reports. "Mr. Reeves, I have reports that you are operating an unlicensed commercial fishing enterprise." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Commercial fishing, Jim? My lake is 3 acres. I would have more success running a shrimp boat in a bathtub." But regulations are not swayed by common sense. Some concerned citizen, and we all knew who, had lodged formal complaints alleging that I was charging neighbors to fish and selling bass covertly, as if I were some kind of aquatic drug lord. This is where Victoria's Harvard-educated real estate acumen collided with my grandfather's 8th-grade education. And you can guess who came out on top. I took Jim inside and opened my grandfather's old tackle box. The leather hinges creaked like aged bones as I extracted 40 years of fishing logs. Every fish caught was documented, dated, weighed, and recorded in pencil that had long since faded to the color of weak tea. "Good heavens," Jim breathed, leafing through decades of painstaking records. "This is more detailed than most professional operations. Your grandfather was meticulous about his records. Grandpa always said documentation trumps accusations every time." I told him, recalling the old man's wisdom on handling government officials. "Paper trails don't fabricate, but people certainly do." Jim's eyebrows rose. "You didn't get this from me, but we've received similar complaints regarding 3 other properties this year. All were unfounded, and all originated from the same person." That evening, my phone rang incessantly. First, it was Eleanor Hutchkins, 73, whose transgression was growing tomatoes that supposedly attracted vermin. "Honey, that woman pulled the same nonsense on me. Claimed my vegetable patch was a health risk because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards." Next, Dave Martinez called. His offense was parking an RV in his own driveway. Victoria had reported him for running a mobile home park on his residential lot. "She claimed I was renting it out to vagrants," Dave said, his voice strained with fury. "I use it for camping with my children twice a year." The Kowalski family's situation was even more dire. Their backyard chickens, 3 hens that supplied eggs for their aging parents, were suddenly labeled a commercial poultry operation and an unsanitary health hazard. As I listened to one story after another, the stench of corruption grew more pungent than the diesel smoke from the county trucks. My father used to say that if several people tell you it's raining, you should probably find an umbrella, even if the sky looks clear. But it was Garrett who put the pieces together. My brother wheeled up to the kitchen table, where I had laid out all the harassment paperwork like a war room map. "She's not just a power freak," he stated, his scarred hands moving over the documents with surgical precision. "Look at the properties." He was absolutely right. Each targeted property was situated on prime real estate, lakefront lots, corner parcels with mature oak trees, large tracts ideal for development, all belonging to people who didn't fit Victoria's exclusive country club image. The elderly, veterans, immigrants, anyone who lacked the resources to fight back. "She's playing the long game," Garrett observed, drawing on his military intelligence background. "Drive out the undesirables, facilitate the right buyers moving in, and pocket real estate commissions from both sides. It's classic gentrification masked as community enhancement." That's when Victoria unleashed her next assault. A certified letter arrived, bearing the kind of legal letterhead that costs more per sheet than most people earn in an hour. The envelope itself seemed to reek of billable hours and smug attorneys. The letter accused me of ongoing violations of community standards, failure to cooperate with reasonable requests, and, my personal favorite, activities detrimental to neighborhood harmony. It threatened the involvement of appropriate state and federal authorities if I failed to immediately cease all disruptive behaviors. The translation was clear. Stop being poor and disabled where affluent people might see you. She's committed a critical tactical blunder. Garrett remarked that evening as we watched the sunset transform our lake into molten gold. She has initiated multiple conflicts without adequate intelligence on her adversaries. Meaning what exactly? Meaning she has just declared war on a group of veterans and old-timers who have been dealing with bullies for far longer than she's been alive. In the Army, we had a saying, never start a fight you can't finish, because someone else will finish it for you. The following morning, Victoria Ashworth was about to discover that harassing disabled veterans is not just morally repugnant, it's also strategically foolish. Because veterans don't merely fight back, they coordinate, they strategize, and they utterly obliterate their opposition. Victoria's subsequent action demonstrated that she had escalated from minor harassment to full-scale environmental terrorism. Because there's no better way to be a good neighbor than to attempt to frame a disabled veteran for contaminating the water supply. I was enjoying my coffee and observing Garrett skillfully use a spinnerbait when my phone lit up with a barrage of texts. Dave Martinez, Health Department at your property. Hazmat suits. Eleanor. Honey, there are government vehicles everywhere. Soon after, Dr. Sarah Wilson, a county health inspector, arrived, attired as if she were there to investigate a nuclear accident rather than a fishing pond. The smell of rubber gloves and industrial sanitizer permeated the morning air as she set up enough testing gear to analyze the bathwater of the Mars rover. Mr. Reeves, we have received grave allegations of bacterial contamination resulting from your recreational fishing. Grave allegations from whom, precisely? The two neighbors who stand by us, or the one maniac who has been harassing us for months? Dr. Wilson clarified that someone had submitted extensive reports asserting our fishing was generating hazardous bacterial runoff that endangered the subdivision's groundwater. According to Victoria's wild imagination, fish entrails and earthworms were apparently turning our immaculate lake into a biological weapon. Ma'am, this lake has existed since Kennedy was in office. If it were harmful to people, I think we would have figured that out by now. But government agencies operate on regulations, not logic. While Dr. Wilson gathered samples as if she were on the trail of the Ebola virus, Victoria's white Range Rover drove by for the fourth time that morning. The woman had abandoned any pretense of subtlety. She was marking her turf like a feral animal. That's when I resolved to adopt my grandfather's philosophy. When someone makes an accusation, disprove it so decisively that they suffocate on their own fabrications. I contracted Aquatech Environmental, the same firm that tests water for high-end resorts. It set me back $3,000 that I couldn't really spare, but as Grandpa used to say, the best revenge is being correct when everyone assumes you're wrong. Garrett had located them online while looking up water quality regulations. If we're going to do this, we're doing it properly, he insisted, his military exactitude taking over. No shortcuts, no margin for error. 2 days later, their analysis came in, and I laughed so hard I nearly toppled into the lake. Our water was purer than what most people get from their kitchen faucets. It had a perfect pH balance, bacterial counts so low they were almost undetectable, and a dissolved oxygen level that would make a trout hatchery envious. The report stated that our natural spring system was, in fact, filtering groundwater for the entire vicinity. But here is where Victoria's brilliant scheme backfired spectacularly. Dr. Wilson's official county analysis showed that while we were operating a natural filtration plant, the HOA's retention pond was little more than a toxic sludge pit. It had high levels of lawn fertilizer runoff, enough chemical agents to sterilize a surgical suite, and chlorine concentrations that could bleach your eyebrows from 50 feet away. Victoria had spent weeks accusing us of environmental offenses while her own prized subdivision was contaminating half the county. The irony was thicker than the chemical muck lining the bottom of their pond. Mr. Reeves, Dr. Wilson called to apologize. Your lake is, in fact, an environmental benefit. It is filtering pollutants from upstream and enhancing water quality downstream. Meanwhile, the health department initiated a comprehensive inquiry into the HOA's water management procedures. Victoria had attempted to incriminate us for poisoning the community while her own associates were managing a Superfund site disguised as a local amenity. But Garrett was not yet celebrating. While I was taking victory laps around the lake, he was immersed in legal research databases, tracing digital trails like a bloodhound with a law degree. Damon, You have to see this, he said, wheeling over with his glowing laptop screen. Victoria's real estate license has been suspended on 2 occasions. Her record reads like a criminal's rap sheet. Colorado, 2018. A campaign of harassment against elderly homeowners. Arizona, 2020. Fraudulent complaints intended to compel property sales. It was the same strategy every time. Target vulnerable individuals. Weaponize the system. Profit from the resulting chaos. She's not just unhinged, Garrett added, scrolling through numerous complaints. She is a professional community saboteur. This is her business strategy. Victoria relocated every few years, leaving in her wake neighborhoods fractured by lawsuits and internal strife. She was like a swarm of locusts in designer attire, devouring communities before moving on to new prey. The health department's findings had roused our neighbors from Victoria's influence. Social media lit up with people recounting their own Victoria horror stories and comparing notes on her manipulative methods. The woman who had dedicated months to isolating us was now suddenly the one left standing by herself. Eleanor arrived with cookies and tears. We should have raised our voices sooner. That woman had us scared to death of lawsuits and special assessments. Dave threw a lakeside barbecue where children learned to fish while the adults exchanged stories of surviving Victoria. For the first time in months, Garrett's laughter resounded across the water. Victoria's reaction was sheer desperation cloaked in feigned authority, an emergency HOA meeting to address malicious disinformation campaigns against legitimate community oversight. But her facade was crumbling. The tailored blazers now appeared creased. The counterfeit smile had soured into a fixed scowl, and that Range Rover was practically carving ruts into our road from her relentless surveillance. Cornered animals act foolishly, Garrett noted as she drove by once more. He could not have known how accurate those words would prove to be. Victoria's final move before her entire world imploded was so profoundly foolish, so transparently criminal, that it made me question if she had experienced some sort of mental breakdown. Or perhaps she had simply inhaled too many vapors from that poisonous HOA pond. It was dawn on a Tuesday, that enchanting time when the lake takes on a silvery sheen and the only sounds are birdsong and the soft hum of Garrett's wheelchair motor as he heads to his preferred fishing spot. The aroma of fresh coffee blended with the morning dew on pine needles. Absolute tranquility. Then, 3 patrol cars came roaring up our driveway, as if we were sheltering a most wanted fugitive. I rushed outside in my underwear and work boots to see 3 bewildered police officers surrounding my brother, who was sitting in his wheelchair holding a fishing rod, looking as though he'd prefer to be on another planet. "Sir, we had a report of trespassing and intimidation of residents," said Officer Martinez, who was not related to our neighbor Dave. "Are you Garrett Reeves?" "I am," Garrett answered with the sort of composure that comes from having faced roadside explosives. "But I'm fishing on my own land, so I'm not clear on what the issue is." The senior officer, a good man named Thompson, was visibly uneasy. "Ma'am, we received a call from a Victoria Ashworth alleging you were on HOA property and menacing homeowners. I produced our property survey while clarifying that our lake is located entirely on family land." The officers examined the documents, glanced at Garrett sitting calmly with his fishing rod, and then looked at one another with expressions that screamed, "What on earth are we doing out here?" "Mr. Reeves, it's clear you are not trespassing," Officer Thompson stated. "However, we are required to submit a report since a complaint has been filed." It was then that I made a choice that would alter the course of everything. "Officers, I would like to file a counter-complaint for the filing of a false police report." Body cameras recorded every word as I detailed Victoria's months-long intimidation campaign, the health department scandal, the fishing license deception, and the methodical targeting of vulnerable neighbors. Thompson's expression transformed from bewilderment to fury as he understood they had been manipulated as pawns in Victoria's personal vendetta. "We will be having a word with Ms. Ashworth regarding the proper use of emergency services," Thompson declared, his jaw clenched with professional displeasure. But that afternoon delivered a revelation that made Victoria's police call seem like a minor league play. Eleanor Hutchkins appeared at our door holding a manila envelope so thick it could stop a door. Her hands were unsteady, but her voice was resolute. "Boys, I've been keeping files. Victoria believes she's been very shrewd, but she made a single error. She underestimated an old person's attentiveness. Within that envelope lay 8 years of documented corruption that would make a mob bookkeeper blush. Victoria's husband, Richard Ashworth, had been surreptitiously engaged as the HOA's management consultant via a shell company named Willowbrook Administrative Services, earning $50,000 a year for administrative oversight that no one had ever authorized. Eleanor possessed copies of the original 1985 HOA charter, which explicitly forbade board members from having financial conflicts of interest. She had bank records indicating payments to 3 different LLCs, all under Richard's ownership: Landscape Consulting, Security Services, Legal Liaison, a shell game crafted to siphon HOA dues into the Ashworth family's accounts. "I have been tracking this for 3 years," Eleanor said, her voice growing more confident. "That woman threatened me with special assessments whenever I inquired about the budget." Garrett's military intellect kicked into high gear, connecting financial points like a Pentagon analyst. "Eleanor, this is more than just embezzlement. This is organized fraud. They have stolen roughly $180,000 annually for 8 years." The calculation was astounding. $1.4 million pilfered from neighbors who had entrusted Victoria with their community's finances. But the deception ran even deeper. Eleanor had pictures of storm damage restorations that Richard's company had supposedly carried out, pool renovations for a pool that was never built, tennis court resurfacing for courts that didn't exist, clubhouse maintenance for a building that was, in fact, Victoria's garage. "She's been submitting insurance claims for non-existent amenities," Eleanor clarified. The insurance companies had paid out against Richard's falsified invoices, and the funds had then vanished into their private accounts. My own hands were trembling as I sorted through the evidence of what was essentially a criminal operation masquerading as suburban administration. Victoria hadn't just been harassing us to conceal her control issues. She had been trying to get rid of witnesses to extensive financial crimes. Every neighbor she has forced out was someone who might have noticed the non-existent amenities, Garrett stated, his intelligence training coming to the forefront. "Eliminate the observant individuals. Retain the compliant ones. Steal everything that isn't bolted down." That evening, I contacted our attorney with proof of federal offenses amounting to millions of dollars: wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Victoria and Richard had constructed a criminal enterprise that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. "Mr. Reeves," my lawyer said after examining Eleanor's files, "this is RICO territory. We are looking at potential criminal forfeiture of all assets, treble damages in a civil suit, and significant prison time." Victoria had escalated from minor harassment to calling the police on disabled veterans, all while sitting on evidence that could utterly ruin her. The woman wasn't just malicious. She was catastrophically foolish. The next morning, she would learn that some errors come with a price tag of $4 million and a federal prison term. The anonymous information that blew Victoria's entire operation apart arrived in the most traditional manner possible. A handwritten note slid under my door at 3 a.m., like a scene from a Cold War thriller. "Check the insurance claims. She's been stealing for years. A friend who cares." There was no signature, no return address, just block lettering from someone who undoubtedly knew where the skeletons were hidden. The paper carried a faint scent of cigarettes and desperation. Garrett and I spent the following day delving into public records like digital excavators. What we discovered made Eleanor's evidence seem like petty cash compared to the actual scale of the theft. Victoria had submitted 2.3 minus Y X Y Y Y 2.3 million in bogus insurance set claims over a 5-year period. Storm damage to Menidius the Torreniver built. Vandalism repairs for facility is the Texas to Don Lion imagination. Fire to Mijitoa communitisen ter tateway sexually estrid should behind their own house. Luca Thisclaim, Garrett said, indicating his laptop screen. 40,000 for flood damage repair to the community tennis courts. I stepped outside and surveyed our neighborhood. What tennis courts exactly? Richard's firm, Willowbrook Administrative Services, had provided itemized invoices for work that was never performed, accompanied by photos of damaged structures that were, in reality, pictures of Victoria's own property, digitally altered to appear as community assets. The insurance companies had disbursed funds based on counterfeit receipts and manipulated documents. But here is where the scheme became particularly inventive. Victoria had reported her personal landscaping projects as community storm damage restoration. Her new patio was billed as sidewalk replacement after vandalism. Her swimming pool refurbishment was claimed as community water feature restoration. The insurance fraud investigator I consulted confirmed our suspicions. The photographs submitted with the claims had been doctored. Digital forensic analysis could establish that the images were manipulated, elevating this to a federal wire fraud case, carrying potential 20-year prison sentences. My grandfather used to say that thieves inevitably become greedy, and greed invariably leads to sloppiness. Victoria had grown so at ease with her stealing that she had stopped being cautious about concealing her activities. Eleanor came by that afternoon with even more damning proof. "I recalled something," she said, producing a shoebox filled with photographs. "I take pictures of neighborhood gatherings every year for the newsletter." Her photos exposed the reality behind Victoria's insurance deceptions. Pictures from community barbecues clearly showed vacant lots where Victoria asserted damaged amenities had been repaired. Photos of her own house from the time she claimed it was the vandalized community center. She's been using her own home as collateral for insurance fraud, Garrett deduced. Claiming personal property as community assets, then receiving insurance payouts for imaginary damage. The total amount stolen was breathtaking. $2.3 million in insurance fraud, plus $1.44 million in management fee embezzlement, amounted to $3.74 million taken from insurance companies and neighbors. With federal treble damages for organized crime, Victoria was facing a potential $12 million civil liability. But the most incriminating evidence was what Eleanor discovered in Victoria's garbage, because it seems criminal masterminds don't bother with proper shredders. There were bank statements showing deposits from insurance companies being funneled directly into personal accounts. Emails between Victoria and Richard discussing which community projects to claim next. Text messages about silencing the old biddy Eleanor with threats of special assessments. She documented her own criminal activity. Eleanor noted with satisfaction. That woman's arrogance has finally caught up with her. The pattern was now unmistakable. Victoria's harassment campaigns were not arbitrary displays of suburban power. They were a systematic effort to eliminate potential witnesses to major financial crimes. Every neighbor she had managed to drive away was someone who might have noticed the non-existent amenities they had supposedly paid to construct and upkeep. Garrett connected the final pieces with military-like precision. She's been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as HOA management. The RICO statute applies to organized crime syndicates, but it also applies to corrupt organizations that systematically defraud their victims. That night, I possessed everything required to bring down Victoria Ashworth completely. Federal crimes worth millions, documented proof, numerous witnesses, and a clear pattern of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Tomorrow, the strategic phase would commence. Grandpa's old workshop was transformed into our command center, and it felt fitting. The scent of motor oil and sawdust mingled with the aroma of Eleanor's coffee as we laid out evidence on workbenches that had witnessed decades of honest work. Now they were the stage for the planning session that would topple the most corrupt HOA president in the county's history. Our group looked like the cast of an unconventional buddy cop film. Me in coveralls, Garrett in his army t-shirt, Eleanor holding her evidence folders like sacred documents. And our lawyer, Jim Morrison. Yes, just like the rock star. And yes, he had heard all the jokes. All right, Morrison began, adjusting his spectacles as he went over Eleanor's files. We are dealing with a RICO case involving multiple federal offenses: wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Garrett had already charted the financial network on his laptop, linking shell companies and bank accounts as if preparing a military intelligence report. The advantage of RICO is the treble damages, he clarified, drawing on his research. If we can prove organized criminal activity, we can claim 3 times the actual damages. Morrison agreed. With $3.74 million in documented theft, we are looking at a potential recovery of over $12 million, plus legal fees and asset forfeiture. The legal approach was beautifully straightforward. File a civil RICO lawsuit while collaborating with an FBI investigation for criminal charges. Morrison took the case on a contingency basis, so we wouldn't owe him anything unless we won. a practice he had adopted after years of confronting powerful adversaries who expected their victims to surrender due to legal expenses. Eleanor had emerged as our clandestine weapon. While Victoria saw her as just another timid, elderly resident, Eleanor had been meticulously recording everything with the precision of a retired accounting clerk. Bank records, meeting notes, photos, and letters. 40 years of corporate expertise applied to neighborhood malfeasance. The main thing is witness security, Garrett stated, his military training evident. Victoria has already demonstrated that she will retaliate against anyone who opposes her. This is where our veteran connections proved invaluable. Dave Martinez had acquaintances in private security, all former military personnel who knew how to protect people from bullies. Within 2 days, we had discreet monitoring on Eleanor's home and safe houses set up for other witnesses. My contact at the local newspaper was practically drooling over the story. Disabled veteran harassed by corrupt HOA president. This is headline news, she said, but we must coordinate the timing with law enforcement to avoid disrupting their investigation. The media plan was essential for witness safety. Public scrutiny would make it more difficult for Victoria to intimidate her victims, and revealing the extent of her crimes would motivate other victims to step forward. Morrison described the forensic accounting procedure as if he were giving a seminar on financial investigation. We will trace every stolen dollar through shell companies and personal accounts. Digital forensics will retrieve deleted files from their computers. Insurance investigators will supply evidence of fraudulent claims. The FBI had been surprisingly open to our referral. It turned out that HOA corruption cases were gaining priority at the federal level after several prominent prosecutions across the country. Our evidence package was so thorough that they appointed a white-collar crime expert within 48 hours. But the most gratifying aspect was seeing our community begin to heal. Neighbors who had been alienated by Victoria's divide-and-conquer strategy were finally sharing their experiences and discovering they had all been subjected to the same manipulation. "She told me you were uncooperative and hostile," admitted Mrs. Patterson from down the road. "I should have realized something was wrong when she wouldn't let me speak to you myself." The new HOA Oversight Committee was composed of actual financial experts, not Victoria's hand-selected allies. They had already passed resolutions mandating independent audits and transparent budget reporting, reforms designed to prevent future corruption. Garrett worked with veteran advocacy organizations that offered legal assistance and media relations support. The story struck a chord with military families nationwide, showing how disabled veterans often face discrimination even within their own communities. The psychological readiness is just as crucial as the legal plan, Garrett reminded us during a late-night strategy session. Victoria will fight dirty because she has everything to lose. We braced for retaliation by documenting everything. Security cameras, recording devices, and backup evidence stored in various locations. Every encounter with Victoria would be recorded and have a witness. The contingency plans addressed every conceivable situation, from witness intimidation to the destruction of evidence. Morrison had injunctions prepared to freeze assets and stop Victoria from leaving the jurisdiction. Federal prosecutors were fully briefed on all the evidence and were ready to file criminal charges at a moment's notice. Eleanor astonished everyone by becoming our most ardent supporter. "I spent 3 years being afraid of that woman," she declared, her voice filled with newfound strength. "Now, I am going to see her answer for every family she has harmed." The trap was laid with military exactitude and legal thoroughness. Victoria had no inkling that her months of harassment had galvanized an entire community against her, or that every desperate action she took was only adding more charges to a federal indictment. Tomorrow, we would see just how far a cornered criminal was willing to go to protect herself. Victoria's desperation escalated to new levels when she opted to retaliate with private investigators and the destruction of documents. Because there is no better way to signal innocence than by shredding records in your garage at 2 in the morning. The first indication that she felt the pressure mounting was when Dave Martinez noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside my workshop for 3 days straight. It was a white sedan with tinted windows, and its occupant was armed with a camera and a telephoto lens capable of spotting a blemish from a different zip code. "Damon, you have a visitor," Dave texted, along with a picture. "This person has been taking photos of everyone who comes to your place." Garrett's network of veteran security contacts mobilized with the swiftness of a military unit. In a matter of hours, we had the PI's license plate number, his employer, and likely even his preferred brand of coffee. It turned out Victoria had engaged Pinnacle Investigations, a disreputable agency specializing in insurance fraud and divorce cases. Their task was to dig up dirt on anyone who supported our case against Victoria. Apparently, when you've pilfered millions from your neighbors, the next logical step is to hire more people to harass them. But Victoria's investigator had no idea he was conducting surveillance on a combat veteran with connections in unexpected places. Garrett's former colleagues from his old intelligence unit took immense satisfaction in reversing the surveillance. By the third day, we knew more about the investigator than he did about us. Marcus Thompson, age 45, 2 DUIs, license suspended in 3 states for illegal wiretapping, Garrett recited from his laptop. This is the best that Victoria could come up with. The real spectacle began on Thursday night when Eleanor's neighbor reported strange activity at the HOA office. Someone was inside with flashlights, feeding documents into what sounded like an industrial-grade shredder. Our security cameras, which had been strategically installed with Eleanor's consent, recorded the entire event. Victoria's white Range Rover was in the parking lot at 2:47 a.m. Her husband, Richard, was seen carrying boxes of documents. The two of them were feeding paperwork into a shredder as if they were disposing of evidence of war crimes. Obstruction of justice is a federal crime, Morrison noted when we showed him the video. She just tacked on another 5 years to her potential sentence. But destroying evidence was not enough for Victoria. Friday afternoon saw her most audacious move yet, an attempt to bribe Eleanor, disguised as neighborly kindness. Eleanor called me right after Victoria's visit, her voice trembling with rage rather than fright. That woman just offered me $25,000 to reconsider my stance on the HOA's finances. The entire conversation had been recorded on Eleanor's phone. She had learned to document everything after months of Victoria's intimidation tactics. It was $25,000 in cash, along with promises to cover Eleanor's medical bills, all dependent on Eleanor developing amnesia about the financial discrepancies. She actually used the phrase, "Sometimes memory problems can be a blessing," Eleanor recounted. "As if I'm some senile old lady she can just buy off." Victoria had just committed felony bribery of a witness in a federal investigation on a recorded call while under FBI surveillance. Garrett shook his head in disbelief. She's not only destroying evidence and bribing witnesses, she's also documenting herself doing it. The campaign of community intimidation escalated over the weekend. Victoria convened an emergency HOA meeting to discuss defending the community against frivolous lawsuits. She threatened special assessments to cover the legal costs of what she termed malicious attacks by disgruntled residents. The meeting was a complete failure for Victoria. Residents who had been quietly supporting us finally spoke up. Questions about missing amenities, absent financial reports, and a lack of accountability transformed the meeting into a spontaneous hearing. "Where exactly are these tennis courts that we have been paying to maintain?" demanded Mrs. Patterson. "Why have we not seen any budget reports in 3 years?" asked Dave Martinez. Victoria's answers became increasingly erratic. She blamed outside influences and disloyal neighbors for spreading lies and misinformation. Her typical feigned composure shattered completely, exposing the snarling tyrant beneath. But the most damning piece of information came from an unlikely source. Richard Ashworth, seemingly realizing his wife was taking him down with her, contacted Morrison through a common acquaintance to discuss a plea deal. Mr. Ashworth is willing to testify against his wife in return for a reduced sentence, Morrison told us. He is turning over financial records that Victoria believed were destroyed. Richard had maintained backup copies of everything: bank statements, insurance claims, forged invoices, and even emails discussing how to deal with difficult residents. The man who had assisted in stealing millions was now handing over evidence on a silver platter to save himself. Victoria's marriage was unraveling along with her criminal activities. Neighbors described shouting matches in the Ashworth's driveway, moving vans at their residence, and Richard's desperate phone calls to lawyers. The private investigator had vanished after discovering he was being watched by the FBI. The document shredding had been captured on film by federal agents. The bribery attempt was recorded evidence, and now her own husband was cooperating with the prosecution. She has made every mistake imaginable, Garrett noted as we watched Victoria's Range Rover zoom past our house for the sixth time that day. Obstruction, bribery, witness intimidation, and now her co-conspirator is turning on her. Victoria Ashworth had transitioned from a suburban tyrant to a federal defendant in a remarkably short time, and she still had no idea that her most significant blunder was yet to come. Victoria's final act of desperation was so profoundly foolish that it made her earlier offenses seem like acts of strategic brilliance. But when you are facing federal prison and your own husband is set to testify against you, planting evidence apparently starts to look like a viable option. It was 3:17 a.m. when the motion detectors around our property illuminated like a Christmas tree. Security cameras recorded a figure dressed in dark attire moving suspiciously around my work truck, placing something under the passenger seat before melting back into the darkness. The scent of cheap cologne and high-end perfume lingered in the air, Victoria's signature blend of desperation and delusion. 6 hours later, my phone rang with the kind of call that sends your blood pressure skyrocketing. "Mr. Reeves, this is Officer Thompson. We need you to come to the station for questioning regarding vandalism at the HOA office." Victoria had dialed 911 at dawn, asserting that she had seen me vandalizing community property the previous night. Her statement claimed she had witnessed me breaking windows and spray painting profanities on the HOA building at 2 a.m. The proof? Paint cans and a crowbar that were inexplicably found in my truck during a routine police search. Here is what Victoria was unaware of. The FBI had been intercepting her communications for weeks. They were aware of her 3 a.m. evidence-planting adventure before I was. Agent Martinez, who had become our federal contact, was practically beaming with excitement. "Mr. Reeves, we are going to let this unfold," he stated as I sat in the interrogation room. Sometimes the most effective way to catch a criminal is to give them enough rope to hang themselves. The local police were playing their part perfectly. Officer Thompson's body camera was recording every word as Victoria gave increasingly detailed accounts of my supposed act of vandalism. She described damage that wasn't there, gave times that could be refuted by surveillance footage, and claimed to have witnessed events that occurred while she was supposedly asleep. "She is making sworn statements," Thompson whispered to me during a pause. "Every falsehood is another count of perjury." Meanwhile, our security system had documented Victoria's entire evidence-planting escapade in high-definition detail. Timestamps, license plates, facial recognition, everything required to prove criminal evidence tampering. The FBI executed their sting operation like a master illusionist. Not only had they recorded Victoria planting the evidence, but they had also been monitoring her phone calls as she planned the frame-up with Richard. She phoned her husband at 2:45 a.m. to verify that the paint cans were in position, Agent Martinez explained. Then again at 6:30 to align their stories about your purported vandalism. Victoria's husband had been wearing a wire for 2 weeks as part of his plea arrangement. Every conversation about framing me, every discussion about destroying evidence, every scheme to intimidate witnesses, all recorded for federal prosecutors. When Victoria showed up at the police station to provide her witness statement, she walked directly into a meticulously set trap. FBI agents took her into custody in the parking lot, while news cameras filmed every second of her perp walk. The list of charges was like a chapter from a criminal law textbook: conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, filing false police reports, and now evidence tampering and perjury. Local news channels went live with breaking news as Victoria was escorted away in handcuffs. The woman who had terrorized our community for months was now the one facing a potential 20-year sentence in federal prison. But the most gratifying part was when Richard's cooperation exposed the full extent of Victoria's corruption. Bank records revealing $4.2 million stolen through insurance fraud and embezzlement, communication records proving systematic harassment of witnesses, and financial documents showing money laundering through various shell companies. She documented it all, Agent Martinez remarked with professional respect. Most criminals try to cover their tracks. Mrs. Ashworth maintained meticulous records of her crimes as if she were operating a legitimate enterprise. The community's response was immediate and decisive. HOA members who had been coerced into silence for years finally spoke out. An emergency meeting was convened to oust Victoria from the board. A vote was held to terminate all agreements with Richard's companies, and a decision was made to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Eleanor stood at the lectern during that meeting, with tears running down her cheeks. For 3 years, I was too afraid to say anything. Today, I am proud to say that we are reclaiming our community. The media attention was precisely what Victoria had tried so hard to prevent. National news outlets covered the story of the corrupt HOA president who had harassed disabled veterans while stealing millions from her neighbors. Social media erupted with the hashtag #JusticeForGrit and calls for HOA accountability across the country. Victoria's mugshot became an icon of entitled suburban corruption. Her impeccably coiffed hair was in disarray, her designer makeup was smudged, and her counterfeit smile had been replaced by the vacant gaze of someone watching their world crumble in real time. She played herself, Garrett remarked as we watched the news coverage from our lakeside dock. Every desperate move she made only piled on more charges. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Asset forfeiture actions were already in motion, and the federal prosecutor was certain of obtaining convictions that would imprison Victoria for the remainder of her functional life. All that was left was the public accountability, the moment when justice would be delivered in view of the entire community Victoria had tyrannized. The crowded town hall resembled a cross between a courtroom and a revival, with over 200 residents packed onto folding chairs that groaned like old ship planks with every movement. The air was thick with the scent of strong coffee, nervous perspiration, and anticipation as 3 news crews positioned their cameras at the back. Victoria was brought in through a side entrance, clad in an orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with her usually impeccable color scheme. She was in handcuffs. Her hair looked as if it had been styled in a wind tunnel. The woman who had once held our neighborhood in a grip of fear now looked as pathetic as a deflated balloon. The federal judge overseeing the proceedings had mandated this public apology as a condition of her plea agreement, though given the mountain of evidence, agreement was a charitable description for what was essentially a complete capitulation. Garrett wheeled himself to the podium in his dress uniform, each medal earned through hardship and sacrifice shining under the fluorescent lights. The American flag pin on his lapel glinted as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice resonating with the quiet strength of a man who has faced true adversaries. "I am Garrett Reeves. Some of you may know me as the person Victoria Ashworth tried to ruin for the offense of fishing while disabled." The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the occasional click of a camera shutter, like a form of mechanical applause. I lost my legs serving this nation in Afghanistan. Upon my return, that lake became my refuge, my solace, my link to the grandfather who taught me that America is a country worth defending. His voice remained steady, but I noticed a slight tremor in his hands. Victoria Ashworth attempted to take that from me because it did not align with her idea of what our community should be. A standing ovation followed. Every veteran in the room, every neighbor who had been intimidated, every individual who had ever confronted a petty despot, they all rose in unison while Victoria stared down at her shackled hands. Federal Prosecutor Janet Williams then took the podium, armed with a PowerPoint presentation that would make a corporate auditor cry. $4.2 million stolen through fraudulent insurance claims and embezzlement schemes over 8 years, she declared, as the figures lit up the screen behind her. A collective gasp went through the crowd as Williams outlined the extent of Victoria's criminal enterprise: non-existent amenities, forged invoices, and money laundering through shell corporations, a white-collar crime spree disguised as suburban leadership. Mrs. Ashworth did not merely steal money, Williams went on. She used bureaucracy as a weapon to intimidate anyone who might uncover her crimes. Elderly residents, disabled veterans, immigrant families, anyone who did not fit her lucrative model of community conformity. When it was Victoria's turn for her court-mandated apology, her lawyer practically had to force her to the microphone. Her voice was barely a whisper as she mumbled something about regrettable misunderstandings and community standards. That is when Garrett delivered the knockout blow that would go viral in a matter of hours. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, wheeling his chair closer to confront her directly, "your apology is noted. But let me be perfectly clear. This was never about fishing regulations or community aesthetics. This was about a criminal who exploited her position to defraud families and terrorize anyone courageous enough to challenge her. The silence in the room was absolute. You saw me in my wheelchair and perceived weakness. You saw Eleanor and perceived a frightened old woman. You saw our neighbors and perceived victims who would not resist. Garrett's voice gained strength with every word. You were mistaken about all of us. The room erupted in applause, cheers, and more than a few cries of justice. As Victoria was escorted out by federal marshals, her perp walk past 200 neighbors and 3 news crews became an immediate social media phenomenon. Judge Henderson pronounced the sentence with the solemnity of someone who has witnessed too many corrupt officials ruin communities for their own enrichment. 13 years in a federal penitentiary for $0.2 million in restitution and a total forfeiture of assets to repay the victims. Victoria's Range Rover was to be sold at auction for the Veterans Fund. Her house would be sold to reimburse the stolen funds. Even her designer purses would be auctioned off to help undo the harm she had inflicted. The community celebration that ensued felt like the 4th of July and Christmas combined into a single, cathartic burst of justice. Children waved American flags as Garrett passed by. Neighbors embraced one another with tears of relief. Someone began playing patriotic songs from their car stereo. The local news interviewed anyone who wished to speak. Garrett became a champion for veteran advocacy, Eleanor a symbol of elderly defiance, and I was able to represent every person who had ever stood up to corrupt power. This case demonstrates that federal law enforcement takes white-collar crime very seriously. Agent Martinez informed the cameras. Defrauding your neighbors and harassing disabled veterans will land you in federal prison. But the most rewarding moment occurred when a young girl approached Garrett and asked if he could teach her how to fish. As he smiled and agreed, I knew my grandfather would have been immensely proud. The lake that had been at the center of this conflict would now instruct a new generation that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to be broken. Victoria Ashworth had finally discovered what happens when you provoke veterans, senior citizens, and people who genuinely care about their community. Justice tastes like cool lake water on a tranquil morning. 6 months on, our neighborhood resembles something from a Norman Rockwell illustration. If Norman Rockwell had depicted scenes of corrupt HOA presidents receiving their just desserts. The aroma of Eleanor's renowned apple pie now wafts through community gatherings where Victoria's scare tactics once contaminated the atmosphere. Children play in our lake while their parents recount tales of confronting bullies. It is the kind of recovery that restores one's faith in the country. The new HOA board's approach makes Victoria's reign look like a farce, but in the opposite way. Monthly financial statements are posted online with the clarity of a government audit, and independent accounting practices would impress the FBI. Eleanor now leads the Oversight Committee, managing spreadsheets with the authority of a seasoned general. That recovered $4.2 million? It led to the best plot twist of all. Instead of merely distributing the restitution funds, our community chose to create the Garrett Reeves Veteran Scholarship Fund. Last month, we presented our inaugural check to Maria Kowalski. Yes, the daughter of the family whose chickens Victoria had tried to have removed. Justice, it seems, has a sense of humor. Our lake has shifted from being a site of harassment to the very heart of the neighborhood. Garrett's weekly fishing clinics teach children patience, respect, and the time-honored skill of detangling a fishing line without losing one's temper. The sound of laughter that now echoes across the water has completely wiped away the memory of Victoria's toxic influence. Eleanor's community garden flourishes where the HOA office once held fraudulent legal papers. Growing something good out of something rotten, she says, which is perhaps the most insightful comment anyone has made about second chances. The positive effects continue to ripple outward. 3 nearby HOAs have adopted transparency measures after learning about our experience. State legislators enacted Garrett's Law, which mandates financial disclosure for all HOA boards. Insurance companies now use Victoria's case as a training module on what to look for. Garrett completed his social work degree and now assists disabled veterans in combating housing discrimination from his office, a converted lakeside shed where the scent of pine needles provides a more effective therapy than any clinical setting. The VA now sends veterans from 3 different counties to his peer support program. The documentary Fishing for Justice won a regional Emmy, and ignited a national dialogue on HOA accountability. Garrett's town hall address is now shown in high school government classes, where teachers use it to demonstrate that ordinary citizens can overcome extraordinary corruption. Victoria is serving her 13-year sentence in federal prison, earning $1.15 an hour in the laundry. Richard received 4 years for his part in the conspiracy. Their former mansion is now home to the Martinez family, a young military couple whose children look up to Garrett as if he were a fishing legend. Our yearly Justice Day festival commemorates Victoria's conviction with veteran ceremonies, transparency seminars, and fishing competitions. The pavilion, constructed with the recovered funds, features a permanent plaque honoring communities that refuse to yield to corruption. But the true victory is this: witnessing neighbors relearn how to be neighbors. Eleanor transformed from a fearful victim into a courageous advocate. Garrett discovered a new sense of purpose in helping other veterans. Our community realized that unity is far more powerful than submission. The Lake Conservation Initiative guarantees clean water for generations to come, and environmental experts are studying our natural filtration system. Victoria's contaminated retention pond has been converted into a butterfly garden, where monarchs flutter above the ground where corruption once thrived. Every morning, I see Garrett wheel himself to the dock where this battle started. The golden light reflects on the water as birds sing in the trees that Victoria wanted to cut down for aesthetic consistency. A sense of peace has descended upon a community that has discovered its own resilience. Here is what I have come to understand. Bullies rely on decent people to remain silent. They manipulate bureaucracy because they believe you will not resist. They prey on the vulnerable because they misinterpret kindness as weakness. They are mistaken about all of us. Corruption flourishes in obscurity but perishes in the light.